In 1888, the kinetoscope was invented by Thomas Edison, along with the zoopraxiscope by Edward Muybridge. The inventions were then used to create a moving picture from a set of photos, and from there, film was sparked. Film was a new form of communication where you could convey ideas through entertainment and connect to people emotionally. Film has also evolved into the largest and most widespread medium of communication today.
In 1879, Edward Muybridge produced the first moving picture, The Horse in Motion, with his new invention of the zoopraxiscope, projecting images at a rapid speed to create a moving picture. On February 25, 1888, in Kentucky, inventor Thomas Edison watched Muybridge demonstrate the zoopraxiscope, and Edison thus became inspired to invent an instrument which does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. Having a moving picture would allow for visual communication that still pictures couldn't provide. Edison and his assistant, William Dickson, started experimenting in 1888, and in 1889, the kentophone was created. The kentophone was demonstrated on a tour of the U.S. and became a rising interest across the country. Kentophones started being made and sold. Without there being a patent on the kentophone, other inventors started creating the same apparatus. But not until the cinematograph was there an invention that made a major change more than William and Edison's. In France of 1895, the Lumiere brothers made the cinematograph, which narrowed down the number of frames per second and projected the moving picture onto a screen, rather than through a peephole like the kinetophone. This meant many people could sit and watch a motion picture together, and created an experience people could not compare to anything else. They could communicate to larger groups of people at a time. In December 1885 in Paris, the Lumiere brothers showed their first screening, and after numerous other screenings, they were to open their first cinematograph theaters in London, Brussels, Belgium, and New York in 1886. The motion pictures were scenes of everyday life, the first documentaries, and the first newsreel. Films were starting to become a new medium of communication, helping people to understand the world, communicating personal and global topics. During the same year, 1885, Edison was creating films of his own: colliding trains, water rushing over the Niagara Falls, waves crashing over the ocean, and more, all involving real-life scenarios or nature. In 1887, films and film projectors started being sold to traveling exhibitors. They would travel from one location to another showing the films. However, watching films were so popular that from the numbers of people watching time and time again, the interest in films wore off in that location, so they would have to move to the next. This new form of screening gave the exhibitors control over the films to create a more audience-pleasing program, hence starting the form of directing and editing, including narration, sound effects, and music. Films from there advanced from one still shot with no editing or techniques into films with multiple shots using different distances, angles, music, and natural color.
The world's first official movie was created in 1888 by French inventor Louis Le Prince. The motion picture was titled Roundhay Garden Scene. It was a silent film that featured actors in a basic storyline. This motion picture became a visual source of communication for people to experience a whole new medium. In 1895, films lasting longer than 10 seconds began being produced. More time for the films meant more ways to communicate and portray the wanted message. The first years of the breakthrough had films longer than 50 seconds, but lacked the synchronization of sound and natural color. Between 1890 to 1927, thousands of silent films were produced, advancing each time with new storylines, technical advancements, and sophistication. Due to their growing success, films and movies started being produced at faster rates, and they rose to popularity within the United States with intensity. The more people attracted to films led to more variety in genres in the 1900s. People in the film industry had started to understand that the films that sold the most were comedies, romance drama, and thrillers. Film was now rapidly growing into a majorly successful and profitable industry. From 1910 to 1920, movies were shifting from short films and becoming longer and more substantial than before. Most movies were now developing complete, more complex storylines and had a running time between 1 to 3 hours. The success of movies such as Birth of a Nation in 1915 and Hearts of the World in 1912 proved that American audiences were willing to sit through movies that ran up to 3 hours. These longer running times allowed for movies to more successfully communicate their messages to larger domestic and foreign audiences. As films gained more attention, people began paying to see movies. Within the first few years of the 20th century, there were multiple theaters devoted to playing and projecting motion pictures. In 1905, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first public movie theater opened up, called the Nickelodeon.
By the 1930s, Nickelodeons all across America were drawing in 100 million people a week, at a time when the country's overall population was only 120 million. The number of weekly moviegoers even surpassed the number of weekly churchgoers, which was 60 million. These first motion pictures attracted all Americans, no matter class, age, or occupation, to the movies. This new medium of communication provided an escape from the sometimes lackluster reality of life for any and all Americans. They found comfort in watching and experiencing the stories of people they could relate to being displayed on a large scale. Movies weren't just selling tickets, they were selling an experience. Movies were proving to be the most widespread new medium of communication in the world. Movies and films in the first half of the 20th century also portrayed taboo subjects that other mediums of communication at that time generally stayed away from mentioning. Movies invited people to talk about topics that were often not discussed publicly. Subjects like sex, crude humor, and mental health were often depicted in film. Sound was added to film in 1926 when Warner Brothers filmed and produced the first ever movie with sound entitled Don Juan, using a Vitaphone. The Vitaphone combined visual and auditory communication, which allowed movies to reach broader audiences. But advancement did not stop there. Years later, Technicolor was added to most films in the early 1940s. These new technological additions to movies only made them more popular, and by 1945, the US was filming and producing more than 400 movies a year. The focus of American films shifted slightly once the United States' involvement in World War II began. It went from being strictly entertainment-oriented to serving as both patriotism and propaganda. Multiple movies began being produced about the Cuban Missile Crisis, World War II, and nuclear paranoia. During this time, films began reflecting more of the social and political unrest of American society. The popularity that motion pictures gained during its time of creation has only grown throughout American history. Film is still a major industry in America, with its overall projected revenue estimated to be $2.09 billion. Film has an undisputed influence on American culture. An example of the power film has on society was the high-grossing movie Blackfish, released in 2015. The movie communicated and exposed all of the horrific events captivity has on orcas. The public actually became so distraught by the film that they forced SeaWorld to completely shut down their killer whale show. Movies use inspiration and play on the audience's emotional senses to leave them thinking about its message long after the movie is over. Movies have shaped all aspects of American culture, from fashion to music to slang to popular pastimes. Because movies hold the power to share a story from multiple different perspectives, they provide us with a more well-rounded view that aids us in better understanding people and the world around us. The combination of visual and auditory communication that film provided the world with during the early 20th century set the groundwork for what is today the world's most widespread medium of communication. In addition to movies, the technology that allowed for the creation of motion pictures eventually led to the creation of TV shows, broadcast news, YouTube videos, documentaries, commercials, and televised sporting events. Film and television is today the most regnant and far-reaching form of communication. It serves as a connection for people all across the world.